From Pacifica, this is Democracy Now!
I'm not going to destroy the world economy, and I'm not going to destroy the economy for our country by being foolish with Saudi Arabia. We are with Saudi Arabia. We're staying with Saudi Arabia. And by the way, just so everybody, I have no business whatsoever with Saudi Arabia.
President Trump doubles down on his support for Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince, despite overwhelming evidence that journalist Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated at the direct order of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman. The New York Times reports top Saudi officials considered using private companies to assassinate enemies a year before Khashoggi's death. We speak with one of the reporters who broke the story, Ronen Bergman, author of Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations, a stunning book Israeli intelligence officials tried to stop him from writing.
This is a book about clandestine operations, which focuses on many of the spaces on targeted killings. Now, in many other countries, that would be seen as illegal, or even if country employs these tactics, people would be ashamed or embarrassed to talk about that. In Israel, people are proud that they took these assignments.
Then we look at the costs of war. Nearly 500,000 people have died in the so-called U.S. war on terror. It's costing the United States nearly $6 trillion. We'll speak with Professor Anita Crawford, lead author of a major new report from Brown University. All that and more coming up. Welcome to Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman. President Donald Trump declared he would stand by Saudi Arabia over the murder of journalist Jamal Khashoggi, who entered the Saudi consulate in Istanbul, Turkey, October 2nd, and was never seen again. In an extraordinary written statement riddled with exclamation points and subtitled America First, Trump wrote, quote, "It could very well be that the Crown Prince had knowledge of this tragic event. Maybe he did and maybe he didn't, exclamation point. That being said, we never know all the facts surrounding the murder of Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. In any case, our relationship is with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia." Trump's statement came even after the Washington Post reported last Friday the CIA has high confidence that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered Khashoggi's murder. Trump was asked by reporters on Tuesday why he is siding with Saudi Arabia over his own intelligence agencies.
Saudi Arabia, if we broke with them, I think your oil prices would go through the roof. I've kept them down. They've helped me keep them down. Right now we have low oil prices, or relatively. I'd like to see it go down even lower. But I think that it's a very simple equation for me. I'm about make America great again, and I'm about America first.
America first, even though Jamal Khashoggi was an American resident. Trump went on to falsely claim Saudi Arabia was investing over $400 billion in the U.S. economy while funding hundreds of thousands of jobs. But a new report from the Center for International Policy found investment from Riyadh is responsible for less than 20,000 U.S. jobs a year and just a fraction of the investment cited by Trump. Trump's defense of the murder of Jamal Khashoggi drew condemnation from members of Congress. Virginia Democratic Senator Tim Kaine called the statement yet another fawning prostration to a foreign authoritarian. Some Republicans, including Senators Lindsey Graham and Rand Paul, have joined calls for new sanctions on the Saudi royal family. Khashoggi worked as a columnist for The Washington Post. In a statement, the newspaper's publisher and CEO, Fred Ryan, said, quote, "President Trump is correct in saying the world is a very dangerous place. His surrender to this state-ordered murder will only make it more so. Trump is placing personal relationships and commercial interests above American interests and his desire to continue to do business as usual with the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia," The Washington Post said. On Tuesday, Trump denied he has any financial ties to Saudi Arabia.
Well, I have nothing to do with Saudi. Just so you understand, I don't make deals with Saudi Arabia. I don't have money from Saudi Arabia. I have nothing to do with Saudi Arabia. I couldn't care less.
That contrasts with Trump's comments at a July 2015 rally in which he declared, "I like the Saudis. I make a lot of money with them. They buy all sorts of my stuff," he said. The Washington Post reports Trump's business ties with Saudi Arabia go back to the 1990s, with Saudi lobbyists spending $270,000 just last year alone to book rooms at Trump's hotel in Washington, D.C. In Saudi Arabia, human rights groups are warning some of the kingdom's most prominent feminists have been tortured and sexually harassed as they've been held for months without charge and without access to a lawyer. Saudi officials began arresting the women in mid-May, many of whom had spent years fighting a ban on women drivers in Saudi Arabia. Both Amnesty International and Human Rights Watch say Saudi guards routinely used beatings, electric shocks, sleep deprivation, and psychological torture against the women prisoners. In Yemen, a new report by the charity Save the Children estimates 85,000 children under the age of 5 have died from acute malnutrition brought on by the U.S.-backed Saudi-led war on Yemen. The finding came as residents of the Yemeni port city of Hodeidah said the last 2 days have seen the worst violence yet in the Saudi-led offensive aimed at seizing the city from Houthi rebels. Hodeidah resident Magid Ghaleb lost 4 daughters when a Saudi coalition airstrike hit their home over the weekend. A 5th daughter was on life support in a hospital whose medical staff has mostly fled for fear of their lives.
You can look at my house. I don't even have a quarter of a kilo of wheat left. So imagine how it is when these crimes happen. We're already dying of hunger, then these airstrikes come and kill us and multiply our problems. We are calling on all the honorable people of the world, all people from all religions, anyone who has a heart, to stop this bloodshed. We cannot take it. Yemenis and their children are being murdered in cold blood.
Save the Children says food shipments through Hodeidah's port have already been seriously curtailed by the fighting and that any further decline could lead directly to famine. The UN has called Yemen the world's worst humanitarian crisis in a half-century, with some 14 million people now at risk of famine, more than half the population. In Afghanistan, a suicide bomb blast tore through a gathering of religious leaders in the capital, Kabul, Tuesday, killing at least 50 people, wounding over 70 others. The bomber targeted a group of Muslim clerics in a wedding hall who'd gathered to observe the birthday of the Prophet Muhammad. There was no claim of responsibility for the attack, which was condemned by the Taliban. Recent similar bombings in Kabul have been claimed by ISIS. In California, Homeland Security Secretary Kirstjen Nielsen Tuesday toured a stretch of the U.S.-Mexico border wall separating Imperial Beach from neighboring Tijuana, warning members of the migrant caravan gathered on the opposite side that the Trump administration would likely reject their claims of political asylum.
Wanting a job is not a basis for asylum under U.S. law. Wanting to be reunited with your family is not a basis for asylum under U.S. law. Wanting to live in the United States, not a basis of asylum under U.S. law.
Homeland Security Secretary Nielsen added the crisis is real and it's just on the other side of this wall. Nielsen's trip came as the Trump administration says it would begin withdrawing thousands of soldiers it mobilized to the border ahead of the midterm elections and after a federal judge halted the Trump administration's plans to bar migrants from seeking asylum unless they arrive at a legal U.S. port of entry. Following that ruling, 29 migrant families will be released from the South Texas Family Residential Center in Dilley, Texas. Many of them come from a region of Central America known as the Northern Triangle, encompassing El Salvador, Guatemala, and Honduras. The area is marked by widespread poverty, extreme gang violence. In a statement, Amnesty International welcomed the releases as a positive step, but blasted the Trump administration over its policy towards migrants, writing, "It's unconscionable to criminalize mothers, fathers, and children who've lost everything. The administration must immediately abandon plans to build more detention centers and tent cities," Amnesty said. In Mississippi, where voters will head to the polls next week for a runoff Senate election, newly surfaced photographs show incumbent Republican Senator Cindy Hyde-Smith wearing a Confederate Army cap and posing with a vintage rifle, sword, and other Confederate artifacts. The photos were from a Facebook post Hyde-Smith published in 2014, which she captioned, "Mississippi History at its Best." This comes after a viral video recorded just days before the midterm election shows Hyde-Smith praising a campaign supporter with the words, quote, "If he invited me to a public hanging, I'd be on the front row," unquote. Mississippi's once considered the lynching capital of the United States, and Hyde-Smith's Democratic opponent, Mike Espy, is African-American. In other Mississippi news, a federal judge has blocked a harsh anti-abortion law from taking effect. The law, known as the Gestational Age Act, was signed by Mississippi Republican Governor Phil Bryant in March. It bans most abortions after 15 weeks with no exceptions for cases of rape or incest. In his ruling declaring the law unconstitutional, U.S. District Judge Carlton Reeves wrote, quote, "The fact that men, myself included, are determining how women may choose to manage their reproductive health is a sad irony not lost on the court," he said. The New York Times reports President Trump wanted the Justice Department to criminally prosecute former FBI Director James Comey and Hillary Clinton. The Times cites two unnamed sources who say Trump's White House counsel, Don McGahn, only dissuaded the president after he warned such a move could lead to Trump's impeachment. The Washington Post reports acting Attorney General Matthew Whitaker was paid more than $1.2 million to lead a charity funded by dark money that bills itself as a nonpartisan watchdog, even as it worked exclusively to advance conservative causes. The charity known as FACT, or the Foundation for Accountability and Civic Trust, is a nonprofit that refuses to reveal its funding sources, but one of the funders is known to be conservative billionaire Charles Koch. Whitaker worked as the charity's sole employee for 3 years, beginning in 2014, until he moved to Washington to work as a chief of staff to former Attorney General Jeff Sessions. Leaders of the U.S. fossil fuel industry knew as early as 1954 that carbon dioxide pollution accumulating in the atmosphere posed a growing threat to life on Earth, but failed to warn the public. That's according to new research published by Stanford historian Benjamin Franta in the journal Nature Climate Change. Franta found in the 50s the American Petroleum Institute commissioned a study by a Caltech scientist which concluded global carbon dioxide levels had risen by 5% in a century. It's the earliest known industry-funded research into climate change, and the findings led in part to a 1965 report by President Lyndon Johnson's Science Advisory Committee on the threat posed by global warming. Speaking to members of an oil industry conference that year, Frank Ickard, then president of the American Petroleum Institute, warned, quote, "This report unquestionably will fan emotions, raise fears, and bring demand for action. The substance of the report is that there is still time to save the world's peoples from the catastrophic consequence of pollution, but time is running out," unquote. The American Petroleum Institute would instead go on to fund decades of climate change denial while fighting efforts to switch to renewable energy sources. The governments of the U.S. and Canada are warning all romaine lettuce recently purchased or currently for sale is unsafe to eat in any form. The U.S. Centers for Disease Control warns the lettuce is at risk of containing a dangerous type of E. coli bacteria and should be thrown away. Last spring, an E. coli outbreak linked to romaine killed 5 people, sickened more than 200 others. That outbreak followed a decision by the Trump administration to shelve water testing rules crafted under President Obama that could have prevented the outbreak. The former president of Michigan State University has been charged with lying to police as they investigated crimes committed by Dr. Larry Nassar, the former USA gymnastics team doctor, convicted of sexually abusing hundreds of girls and young women. Police say the former MSU president, Lou Anna Simon, lied when she said she told investigators she didn't know Nassar was the subject of a 2014 Title IX investigation into a campus sexual assault complaint. Nassar was later cleared by Michigan State University of wrongdoing in that case. Simon resigned last March. On the same day, Dr. Nassar was sentenced to 175 years in prison for sexually abusing over 150 people. Simon faces 2 felony counts and 2 misdemeanor charges that could bring up to 4 years in prison. She's the 3rd current or former MSU official charged with covering up for Dr. Nassar. And here in New York, Mujahid Farid, a leading organizer in the push to release elderly people from prison, has passed away from cancer. He died Tuesday at home, surrounded by friends and family. Farid founded the campaign Release Aging People in Prison, known as RAP, when he was released from prison in 2011 after serving 33 years on a 15-to-life sentence. In a 2016 interview here on Democracy Now!, he described RAP's message, "If the risk is low, let them go."
One of the reasons that our campaign focused on the elderly is because they present the lowest risk of recidivism. And if parole boards were really concerned about public safety when a person comes up for release, these are the people who should be released. We are actually concerned about mass incarceration in general and the whole spectrum. But we thought that by focusing on this particular population, it would present us as the voice of reason and show how this punitive policy that is in place has really gone amok.
That's Mujahid Farid, who died Tuesday at the age of 69. To see the full interview, go to democracynow.org. And those are some of the headlines. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman.
And I'm Juan Gonzalez. Welcome to all of our listeners and viewers across the country and around the world. Despite overwhelming evidence that Saudi journalist Jamal Khashoggi was assassinated at the order of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman, President Trump stood by Saudi Arabia Tuesday in an extraordinary written statement riddled with exclamation points and subtitled America First, writing, quote, "It could very well be that the Crown Prince had knowledge of this tragic event. Maybe he did and maybe he didn't. That being said, we may never know all of the facts surrounding the murder of Mr. Jamal Khashoggi. In any case, our relationship is with the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia." Trump's statement came even after the Washington Post reported last Friday that the CIA has high confidence that Saudi Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman ordered the assassination. Despite this, Trump repeated Saudi claims that Khashoggi was an enemy of the state and a member of the Muslim Brotherhood. This is Trump speaking to reporters Tuesday.
I'm not going to destroy the world economy, and I'm not going to destroy the economy for our country by being foolish with Saudi Arabia. This is about America first. They're paying us $400 billion plus to purchase and invest in our country. That's probably the biggest amount ever paid to the United States. This is over a long period of time. It means hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars of investment and product.
Trump's claims that Saudi Arabia is investing $400 billion in the United States is false. A new report from the Center for International Policy found investment from Riyadh is responsible for fewer than 20,000 U.S. jobs a year and just a fraction of the investment cited by Trump.
Saudi officials have tried to dismiss journalist Jamal Khashoggi's death as a rare, unauthorized killing. But a recent New York Times report suggests the kingdom has sought out private companies to assassinate perceived enemies since the beginning of Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's rule. Last week, the Times reported top Saudi intelligence officials close to bin Salman considered a $2 billion plan to hire private intelligence operatives to assassinate prominent Iranians, for example. Well, for more, we go to Tel Aviv, Israel, where we're joined by an Israeli investigative reporter who helped break the story, Ronen Bergman. He has just written an exhaustive new book on the long, secretive history of Israel's extrajudicial killing program. It's titled Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations. Ronen Bergman is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and senior national security correspondent for Yediot Aharonot, Israel's largest daily paid newspaper. His piece in the New York Times is headlined, Saudis close to Crown Prince discussed killing other enemies a year before Khashoggi's death. Ronen Bergman, welcome to Democracy Now! Before we go into the secret history of Israel's targeted assassinations, let's talk about this latest news. President Trump standing before reporters and explaining why he will continue to side with Saudi Arabia and the Crown Prince of Saudi Arabia. Despite the CIA saying it's clear that Khashoggi was killed on Crown Prince Mohammed bin Salman's orders. Can you respond to this and talk about the history of Saudi Arabia and assassination?
Sure. Thank you, Emil and Juan, for inviting me to the show. I think that what President Trump just did was the highest level of what the French called realpolitik. He took one interest of the United States, as he sees it, at least, to have these huge deals, or alleged huge deal with the Saudi Arabia government and their funding of huge arms deals, and put this as only one consideration and put aside all the rest, human rights, the horrific operation to kill a journalist in their territory, in the consulate, I would say, very conclusive evidence suggesting that high Saudi officials, if not the Crown Prince himself, were deeply involved, and said, I just don't care about that. And, I think this is... he's not the first one who did that. We saw that a few times, or many times in world politics before, but it's really done in a very blunt way. We have published, David Kirkpatrick, Mark Mazzetti, and myself last week in the New York Times, that this is a rare case. This is not an operation by one Saudi official. That as early as March 2017, more than a year ago, the Saudis were pitched by a group of businessmen, former operatives of Israeli and American intelligence, Israeli intelligence and American businessmen, who asked the Saudis to fund a $2 billion project to cripple Iranian economy. So to create something in a sort of a small Iran-Contra affair, to create a huge private intelligence organization that would use black operations to cripple Iranian economy. While they were discussing this, and on the Saudi side, the manager of these negotiations was General Mohammed Asiri, the chief assistant to Mohammed bin Salman, the crown prince, to MBS. One of the Saudi officials came to the Israelis and Americans and said, do you also do kinetics? They understood him. They said, they knew that kinetics means to kill people. And said, who do you want us to kill? And said, we want you to take out some Iranian officials. They asked, like who? And he answered, we want you to take out few Iranians, including Qasem Soleimani, the commander of the Al-Quds force, the Revolutionary Guard. That's probably the most important Iranian official, the most powerful Iranian intelligence operative. And when the foreigners said no, the people of Saudi intelligence, the officials said, well, maybe you can recommend us to someone. And they recommended them a group of a former special operation expert, British one in London, who might do the kinetics. What this proves is that as early as early last year, early 2017, the Kingdom of Saudi Arabia changed its policy. And instead of the diplomacy based mainly on bribe, on money, and staying very much away from secret operation, targeted assassination, they took a much proactive and considered and pitched even a private businessman. This is a very unprofessional move to involve people who are not among your own forces in these kind of sensitive operation. They asked them whether they are willing to take the assignment for a lot of money, some of the kingdom's enemies.
Well, Ronen Bergman, I wanted to ask you in terms of this attempt by the Saudi government to get involved in these kinds of assassinations. Is it your sense? I mean, Israel, as you document in your book, has been practicing targeted assassinations now for decades. But I recall back in the 60s, or even going back further to the 50s, this was a rare situation. I remember, for instance, in the story of a professor from Columbia University, Galindez, who the dictator Trujillo had kidnapped off the streets of New York City, a Columbia University professor, and he was put on a plane to the Dominican Republic and thrown out of the plane. Subsequently, the two assassins who had kidnapped him were themselves killed by Trujillo. But this was considered a rare situation back in the 50s and the 60s. Can you talk about how whether your sense is that governments are now increasingly resorting to this kind of assassination to settle their political aims? I'm thinking now, for instance, of the several assassinations we've seen linked to Russian dissidents by the Putin government. Is this becoming an increasing trend across the world?
Well, first, I think we need to differentiate. Israel has been using targeted killing more than any other country in the West post the Second World War. But Israel has defined enemies and defined targets for targeted killings, either proliferators of weapons of mass destruction or terrorists. We are now talking about something very different. This is killing political opponents. And I think maybe someone in Saudi Arabia saw what Putin has been doing, or allegedly at least doing, in the last few years, which is killing, poisoning, shooting them, and got maybe jealous of what the Russians have been doing, intimidating other rivals and dissidents, and tried to do the same. But in that case, the operation was done in such an amateurish way, in such an unprofessional, so to speak, way. It was very easy to discover. I think that it's either the Saudi untrained or very hubris, thinking that they can get away with everything. What we see, that technology, the ability of the Turkish intelligence to intercept calls and phone conversations and conversations inside the consulate, the fact that everything is being monitored by cameras, the way that metadata is being achieved, that makes operations for terrorists, but also to state-sponsored assassins, much, much harder these days. And here we have the British track down the assassination and Turkish intelligence basically cracking open the botched operation to kill Mr. Khashoggi.
Well, we're going to break and then come back to the succession. I'm sorry we're having some trouble with dropout. Ronen Bergman is speaking to us from Tel Aviv, but we're going to forge forward. But we're going to end this segment back on the lawn with President Trump. When he was asked by CNN reporter Jim Acosta, that's right, Jim Acosta, who, because of a court order, has had his press pass given back to him, he asked President Trump if he's letting Saudi Arabia get away with murder.
No. This is about America first. They're paying us $400 billion plus to purchase and invest in our country. That's probably the biggest amount ever paid to the United States. This is over a long period of time. It means hundreds of thousands of jobs, billions of dollars of investment and product. And if you think I'm going to let Russia have that money or those things, if you think I'm going to let China make the military equipment, hey, China and Russia would love to make $100 billion worth of military equipment from Saudi Arabia. We have the contracts. They wanted those contracts. That would be a big, fat, beautiful gift to Russia and to China. They're not going to get that gift. Just so you understand, it's about Make America Great Again. It's about America first. We're going to stay with Saudi Arabia.
We're going to stay with Saudi Arabia, President Trump says, despite what even the Central Intelligence Agency is telling him, that the Crown Prince himself was responsible for ordering the assassination of Jamal Khashoggi, both an immigrant to this country as well as a journalist, a columnist with the Washington Post, both targets of President Trump over his 2 years. We are speaking with Ronen Bergman, and we'll continue with him on his book, Rise and Kill. First, the secret history of Israel's targeted assassinations. Stay with us.
يا حسرتي مخلوق مريت صبحي أحيي شجرة توتي مالي من يقول اليوم يفوتي ما لقيت تمال لطايب.
Lullaby by Reem Kelani. This is Democracy Now!, democracynow.org, The War and Peace Report. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We're continuing our discussion with Israeli investigative journalist Ronen Bergman, author of a stunning book on the long, secretive history of Israel's extrajudicial killing program, Rise and Kill First, the secret history of Israel's targeted assassinations. It's a book that Israeli intelligence officials desperately tried to prevent Bergman from writing. They even changed and extended secrecy laws to prevent him from gaining access to historical documents. Despite their efforts, Bergman gained unprecedented access while writing the book, meeting with 1,000 sources from Israel political leaders and Mossad heads to the assassins themselves. He also obtained thousands of classified documents, illuminating the shadowy corners of Israeli spy agencies.
The result is an exhaustive, illuminating investigation that dives deep into the targeted killing programs of Israel, which has assassinated more people than any other country in the Western world since World War II. It looks at the way Israel's assassination program has influenced America's post-9/11 foreign policy under Bush, as well as President Obama. Ronen Bergman writes on the book's prologue, nowadays, when the same kind of extrajudicial killing that Israel has used for decades is being used daily by America against its enemies, it's appropriate to study the high moral price that's been paid for the use of such power. Ronen Bergman, we thank you for staying with us. Again, we're getting a number of hits on this Tel Aviv satellite, so we're going to try to stick with you as long as we can hear you. But in the note on your sources at the beginning of your book, you talk about how difficult it was to get access. You say a petition to the Supreme Court for an order forcing compliance with the law that was to get you information was dragged out over years with the complicity of the court, ended with nothing but an amendment to the law itself. The secrecy provisions were extended from 50 to 70 years, longer than the history of the state. Many in Shin Bet and Mossad were warned not to speak to you. How did you get access to this information, and what did you find?
Thank you. When we exited that court, that petition to Supreme Court that day, one of the chiefs of Israeli intelligence, this was already some years ago, he said, Ronen, don't worry, you will never get hold of these documents because when the state is 70, we will prolong it to 100 years. And just last week, Benjamin Netanyahu, Israeli Prime Minister, now the state is 70 years old, prolonged it to 90 years. So they are trying to keep these documents away from the public. Fortunately for me and hopefully the readers of the book, many veterans of Israeli intelligence kept or forgot in their possessions many documents and shared them with me. Why did they speak? I think they spoke. Everyone has her or his own reason, but I think that if there's a common ground for why did they speak, most of them on the record, Prime Minister, Minister of Defense, Chiefs of Staff, Chiefs of Mossad, to the actual operatives, I think they spoke because they wanted to tell a story. They wanted to tell people of Israel, the people of the world, how and why did they take part in these daring, brave, and controversial operations. They wanted to make sure, after so many years in the dark, they wanted to make sure that their parts in history is being told. Some of them told me, I'm telling you stuff that I didn't tell even my wife. And when they spoke, many of them repeated, and they were, of course, completely disconnected from or not synchronized with each other, but they repeated one sentence, one quote from the Babylonian Talmud, which says, if someone comes to kill you, rise up and kill him first. And I think this was said not as an alibi or justification. This was said as to explain a mindset, to explain why have they done things that are considered to be, controversial, if not more than that, because these people, the people that they have killed, are considered to be threat to the sole existence of the nation, to a possible risk for a second annihilation. And they wanted these stories to be known, and the reason, and the moral reasons, and also how effective targeted killings are in the course of history.
Ron, I wanted to ask you, first of all, your book is mesmerizing. There's so much detail and so well written in terms of the various actions taken by the Israeli of the intelligence forces. But I wanted to ask you about, because you go into the early history, even before the establishment of the State of Israel and the clandestine and guerrilla organizations that were part of the liberation movement of the Israelis back in those days. And you say from the outside, the Israeli intelligence from the outset occupied a shadowy realm, one adjacent to yet separate from the country's democratic institutions. The activities of the intelligence community, most of it Shin Bet and the Mossad, under the direct command of the prime minister, took place without any effective supervision by Israel's parliament, the Knesset, or by any other independent external bodies. What damage has been done to the democratic institutions of Israel as a result of this almost parallel situation? Instead of the civilian controlling the military, it was almost as if the military or the intelligence community controlled the government.
Well, few things. First, Israel is a liberal democracy in the Middle East. But Israel also faces severe threats and living under the trauma of the Holocaust. And I think that the new Israelis, the Jews who lived in Palestine, or those who came from the Holocaust and established the State of Israel, they drew three main lessons from the Holocaust. First, that there will always be someone who wants to kill them. That the other non-Jews would not do anything to help. And third is that they need to have Israel a safe haven, a refuge, and guard it with whatever possible. Now, when you have this at the back of your mind, and every decade your prime nemesis, your chief adversary, Nasser of Egypt, Saddam Hussein of Iraq, Yasser Arafat, Ahmadinejad of Iran, when they want to eliminate you or call for your destruction and take physical actions to do this, then you are left with basically one conclusion, or the Israelis were left with one conclusion: rise and kill first, paying very little tribute to international law, international norms, and building these two sets of law, one for regular matters and one for the intelligence community and the military. Now, these were under strict orders of the political levels. They were not doing whatever they wanted. But the political level did not use any kinds of plausible denial. They actually ordered the use of special operations way beyond enemy lines, planting of viruses, sabotage, and at its peak, targeted killing in order to achieve goals. And what are the goals? The goals are to prevent the next war, to try and enlarge the gap between one war to another, if not to prevent the next war, and try to combat the threats to the country without getting into an all-out battle. So kill the enemy at stake instead of going to an all-out war, because Israel cannot stand these wars forever. Now, you ask about the damage. Of course, a democracy that adopts two sets of law, one for regular overt set of law and one secret for the intelligence community, this is a problem. This is a highly legalized and moralized problem, and it led to clashes between these two sets of law. The people of Israeli intelligence would say, yes, we knew that we are cleaning the sewage. And everybody in Israel also figured out what we are doing in order to clean the sewage, meaning dealing with our enemies. But there was no other way to go.
Talk about the attempts to assassinate Yasser Arafat and how far back they went. The former PLO chairman, multiple times the Israeli military tried to kill him. You document different attempts in your book and have said the hunt for the person who was codenamed the head of the fish, Yasser Arafat, was most extensive and long-term in the history of Israeli intelligence.
Yes, it dates back to 1968, shortly after Arafat was appointed not just the chief of Fatah, but the chief of the umbrella organization called the PLO, the Palestinian Liberation Organization. And the IDF, the Israeli Defense Forces, were desperate. They were sending, Arafat and the PLO were sending groups of terrorists from Jordan to Israel. They couldn't catch them, they couldn't catch him. An attempt to invade Jordan and kill them, end up in a catastrophe. And then the chief psychiatrist of the Israeli Navy came with what he said is a solution. He saw that movie, American movie, The Manchurian Candidate, and said, I can do the same. I can take a Palestinian, hypnotize him, Jason Bourne style, program him, and send him to Jordan to kill Yasser Arafat. And believe it or not, the chiefs of Israeli intelligence, military intelligence and Mossad, took that very seriously. They gave him a Palestinian prisoner who fit the profile that the psychiatrist thought would be suitable for such a process. They gave him a training facility with live ammunition, and for months he trained that person until one night he said, okay, he's okay, he's done, he's fully programmed. That Palestinian crossed the Jordan River, and after crossing, he signaled a gun and okay to his master, to his psychiatrist, and he carried the gun and a walkie-talkie, a wireless communication device, and the psychiatrist said he's now going to kill Arafat. This was something like 1 a.m. At 5 a.m. in the morning, the operatives of Israeli intelligence received a report from another agent, said that someone, a Palestinian, came to a Jordanian police station and told the policeman, the stupid Israelis thought that they hypnotized me, but I was just playing a role. I'm loyal to Arafat. Please take me to Abu Ammar, to Yasser Arafat, to swear allegiance to the Palestinian Authority. Now, this is a bit, sometimes Israeli James Bond looks more like Inspector Clouseau. This is a bit of funny story, but the other stories were less funny. Israel tried to kill Arafat numerous times.
And Ronan, did they ultimately succeed? There are, of course, many questions about Arafat's final death, whether it was natural or not.
Let me just add that they tried many times, and the peak of that was in 1982, when Ariel Sharon, Israeli Minister of Defense at that time, ordered to take down a commercial airline with hundreds of passengers on board in order to kill Yasser Arafat. But the chiefs of Israeli Air Force rebelled against him, and they didn't want Israel to be stained in these horrific war crimes, and they didn't want to violate the ethics of war of the IDF, and they prevented the operations from happening. To your question, there is an ambiguity and a few different reports about that. Let me just tell you that a few months before Arafat's mysterious demise, Israel Prime Minister Ariel Sharon met with President Bush at the White House. And the president told him, Mr. Prime Minister, we heard that there are plans, that you have plans to kill Yasser Arafat, and we want you to promise me that you will not assassinate Arafat. And Ariel Sharon said, I see your point, Mr. President. Now, President, of course, understand this is not the promise, said, I really wish you to promise me that you will not do that. To which Sharon said, Mr. President, you are making a very strong argument. But the president didn't let it go until Prime Minister Sharon promised in his voice that he will not kill Arafat. A few months later, Arafat dies of a mysterious disease. I think in time, we will have the opportunity to tell the story behind that. In the meantime, the Palestinians are convinced, of course, that the Mossad or Israeli intelligence killed him.
And what about you, Ronan? What do you think?
I think that in time we will be able to tell the real story behind that. But I think that if Israel done that, the reason to hide the real story was not because of the Palestinians, but because this would be a striking violation to a very clear promise by Israeli Prime Minister to an American president.
You also talk about, we only have a minute left, but how George W. Bush adopted Israeli tactics. And then you say that President Obama would launch several hundred targeted assassinations.
After September 11, Prime Minister Sharon ordered all Israeli intelligence to open their door to perform what was later called as a striptease in front of American intelligence and show them everything they have on intelligence collection and targeted killing, because he thought this would be the right way, the right move from the American armed forces and intelligence community to go for the war, the global war on terror. Much that was done by the United States in the years after is based on Israeli experience, know-how, and technology. I am saying that the U.S., while adopting these tactics, also needs to see the moral lesson, the moral price that Israel has paid. When you kill someone, even if that someone is Satan himself, I believe that something is dying in you. And when you have practically thousands of people, because of technology, because of guided munition, because of cybers, actually thousands of people in Israel have participated directly or indirectly in targeted killing operations. This is a problem. And the most important, I think, is that some of Israeli leaders drew the wrong conclusion from the really remarkable successes of their intelligence services. And they thought that they can use these exotic capabilities to go for pinpoint operation way beyond enemy lines to kill people in order to solve every problem, not just tactical threats to your citizens, but also political problems, also historical problems, to hold history by its tail. And therefore, I think that the story of the book, the story of Rise and Kill First, after 8 years of research, and as you said, 1,000 interviews, if there's a lesson, is that these operations have tactical meanings. They save lives. They are effective. But this is a story of a tactical success, but also of a very, very dangerous strategic political failure. Because once you think that using force can solve everything, then you don't need to turn into statesmanship, into diplomacy, into a real discourse with your adversary.
You talk about killing the devil himself. What about when you're killing innocent civilians?
Of course, the moral price paid, not just the moral price, the price paid for killing civilians, for collateral damage is horrendous. But when you come to these operatives and speak with them, and they tell you, look, we were facing situations, and the book consists of many of these really dramatic moments, when you know you have a window of opportunity to kill a Hamas jihadist organization, a jihadist terrorist organization, who have already sent suicide bombers that already killed hundreds of Jews and Israelis. And you have a very short window of opportunity to kill him before he sent more suicide bombers. And he's walking only among civilians. He's walking in populated areas. He's walking with his wife. Then the operatives, when I ask them, why did you permit collateral damage? They ask me back, so what would you do? If you do not kill him, you know that many of your own people will be killed tomorrow. What do you do?
But of course, what we see now, Ronen, and we have to go, what we see now, Ronen, is how many hundreds of Palestinians have been killed, defenseless people in protest. And in the end, the only prime minister, the Israeli prime minister, who was assassinated by a right-wing Israeli fanatic.
I agree. And the fact that he was not stopped was because nobody thought that anyone could do that. No Israeli. I agree.
Well, Ronen, we want to thank you so much for being with us. Ronen Bergman, Israeli investigative reporter. His new book, Rise and Kill First, The Secret History of Israel's Targeted Assassinations. Ronen Bergman is a staff writer for the New York Times Magazine and senior national security correspondent for Yedioth Ahronoth. His piece in the New York Times will link to Saudis close to Crown Prince discuss killing other enemies a year before Khashoggi's death. This is Democracy Now! We'll be back in 30 seconds on the costs of war. The so-called war on terror has cost the United States close to $6 trillion and 500,000 deaths in Afghanistan, Pakistan, Iraq. Stay with us. Baghdad by Aidin Nadim. This is Democracy Now! I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.
We end today's show with the cost of America's endless war in the Middle East, as a new report reveals that nearly 500,000 people have died from violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan since 2001, when George W. Bush declared a war on terror in the wake of September 11th.
This war on terrorism is going to take a while. And the American people must be patient. It is time for us to win the first war of the 21st century decisively, so that our children and our grandchildren can live peacefully into the 21st century.
President Bush referred to the war as a crusade. More than 17 years later, the war in Afghanistan is the longest in U.S. history. A major new report from Brown University's Cost of War Project has found that more than 480,000 people have died from violence in Iraq, Afghanistan, and Pakistan, including soldiers, militants, police, contractors, journalists, humanitarian workers, and civilians. Several times as many people have died indirectly because of water loss, sewage, and other infrastructural problems and war-related disease. The wars have uprooted 21 million Afghan, Iraqi, Pakistani, and Syrian people who are now refugees of war or internally displaced.
Cost of War also looks at the ballooning financial costs of the wars, with the U.S. spending close to $6 trillion through 2019, including for veterans' benefits, medical treatment over the next 40 years. Interest costs would add another $8 trillion in the next 4 decades. This comes as President Trump has signed a $674 billion military budget in September for the 2019 fiscal year. For more, we go to Nita Crawford, the director of Costs of War Project, author of the report just out, both on the financial costs and human toll of the so-called global war on terror. Professor and department chair of political science at Boston University. Professor Crawford, thanks for joining us. Tell us what you have found at this point.
Well, we found that after 17 years, these wars are at stalemate, and we have plans to keep going. We're going to spend probably another $100 billion over the next 5 years. That is, in addition to the nearly $6 trillion that we've already spent and obligated.
And Professor Crawford, in terms of the American people largely see these wars as winding down, obviously as more and more U.S. troops are pulled out, but yet the death toll, especially in places like Afghanistan, seems to be on the increase.
That's right. In Afghanistan, the number of suicide attacks by militants or the fighting between the militants and the forces of the U.S. and the Afghan military and police is increasing in some areas. And in fact, the U.S. military sees this war as basically at a stalemate. And that's in part why the United States has moved toward negotiations with Taliban.
Can you talk about why you did this report and the astronomical costs, most importantly human lives, but also the financial costs?
Well, we wanted to highlight both the cost to Americans in terms of U.S. soldiers and sailors who've lost their lives, about 7,000 people. But in addition, remind us all that contractors, more contractors, in fact, have died because of their involvement in these wars than soldiers and sailors. And that, of course, many thousands of civilians have been killed, wounded, and displaced. Many millions have been killed, wounded, and displaced.
And generally what happens is you mentioned the contractors, but again, the reason the American public rarely hears about this is that even the contractors that are brought into places like Afghanistan and Iraq generally employ people that are not Americans. And so basically the toll is internationalized, and the American public doesn't really get a sense of what's actually going on.
Right. A lot of these wars is now sort of externalized or displaced. So think about the contractors, as you've said, they're from other places, but they work for and are paid for by U.S. corporations. But other things are externalized. So, for instance, the healthcare costs of the veterans. Yes, billions are paid for the veterans in the 3 million U.S. veterans that are home now, some of them are on disability. That's being paid for by the U.S. government, but some of those costs are actually borne by the families of veterans. So much of what is spent we actually can't account for because these costs are borne by other people. So when people are injured or killed in war zones, yes, we hear about it, but that's just the tip of the iceberg, I think, in terms of direct and indirect death.
I mean, you talk about, we hear about it. There's so little coverage, for example, of what's happening in Afghanistan. Yet, according to a Forbes report, the U.S. actually dropped more bombs on Afghanistan this year alone than since the war began. The report finding, quote, according to U.S. Air Force's Central Command data, manned and unmanned aircraft released 5,213 weapons between January and the end of September 2018. What do you think? Right, go ahead.
Yeah, these wars are actually leaving the war zones in rubble. And you haven't mentioned Pakistan yet. But the United States has also been through drone strikes and other action fighting in Pakistan since 2002 in order to chase and defeat Taliban, al-Qaeda, and now ISIS. So the war zones are actually expanded from what we thought they would be in 2001, 2002, 2003. Now the U.S. forces are operating in between 80 to 90 countries all over the world.
And the relation between war and climate change, you say the Pentagon's the single largest user of petroleum?
That's right. Between 2010 and 2015, the Pentagon used about 105 billion barrels of oil on average each year. They've tried to economize because obviously that's expensive, but it is the single largest producer of greenhouse gases in the United States and abroad.
And briefly, how were you able to conduct this research, given how little attention the U.S. government or the Afghan government actually pays to counting the toll of people killed as a result of these battles and these attacks?
Right. Well, things have gotten harder. For example, the Special Inspector General for Afghanistan Reconstruction, who investigates U.S. operations for looking for waste, fraud, and abuse, has not been able to release to the American public figures that were previously known about the number of Afghan soldiers and police killed in these wars. So the Afghan people know that their soldiers are paying a high price in death and injury, but the American people don't know that. And we don't know how large even the Afghan military is. There are other pieces of information that were previously available, which have essentially disappeared down a memory hole or been sort of given to us in a barrage of information, sort of a fire hose of information, so we can't pick out the relevant details. So in a sense, it has become harder to do these reports because there's more information withheld.
Nita Crawford, we have to leave it there. Co-director of the Cost of War Project. We'll link to your report, professor and department chair of political science at Boston University. Tune in Thursday, Thanksgiving Day, for a special broadcast with renowned dissident and linguist Noam Chomsky on the twin threats of nuclear war and climate change, the election of a far-right army captain in Brazil, and how U.S. foreign policy in Latin America has led to the migrant crisis. On Friday, we'll bring you our exclusive report, breaking the media blockade in Moroccan-occupied Western Sahara. 4 days in occupied Western Sahara, a rare look inside Africa's last colony. That's Thursday and Friday Democracy Now! Specials. Democracy Now! Produced by Mike Burke, Dina Guzder, Nermeen Sheikh, Carla Wills, Tammy Warrenoff, Sam Alcoff, John Hamilton, Robbie Karen, Honey Massoud. I'm Amy Goodman with Juan Gonzalez.